There's been a leak. We love a leak, don't we? But this time of a Home Office report, which I think the findings of it are actually quite worrying. The Home Office, and these are the people that are meant to be across the Prevent Anti-Terrorism programme, the definitions of what extremism is. At the end of the day, the Home Office and its officials, and of course the Secretary of State, the Home Secretary, are essentially in charge, along with the police and the secret services, of keeping Britain safe. And there seems to be a huge amount of confusion at the Home Office now about what extremism actually is.
Yes, this report was put together after the protests that followed the appalling events in Southport with the murder of those 3 little girls. Yvette Cooper asked for this rapid sprint, as it was described, to look at how we think about extremism in the country, and it has come up with this report, which has almost immediately been actually rejected by ministers. But as you say, Home Office officials seem to have got themselves into a position where what started as a very singular response to terrorism, Islamic terrorism attacks in the United Kingdom, particularly 7/7, the London bombings, has morphed into all sorts of different areas, which has become so confused that many people are now critical that the prevent process itself has become close to useless. What has happened is that it started off with Islamic terrorism, then far-right terrorism was introduced. Then this leaked report suggested that that should now be extended to include misogyny, to include harmful communications, to include psychological harm. And I think the problem we are getting into here is that terrorism is a very specific thing about a twisted idea of an ideology, meaning that you try and create mass killing events to try and further your twisted interpretation of what that ideology may or may not be saying. That has now been pushed into anything that is terrifying.
Yes.
Terrorism and being terrifying are 2 different things.
That's right.
And obviously the whole debate has come into even sharper focus with Axel Rudakabana, who was found guilty of those appalling crimes in Southport. Why did he do what he did? Was he a lone wolf motivated by all sorts of different grotesque material online, whether that's misogynistic, whether that's Islamic, whether that's far right, whether that's crazy far left? Does that make him a terrorist? And that's where the whole debate has come from. And what seems to have happened is the Home Office, which is where we always have this problem with the state, is they have simply allowed for increasing mission creep, forgetting what Prevent was originally set up for.
Because we can have a debate about the difference between extremism and terrorism. But the terror element has to have that kind of politically, ideologically, religiously motivated bent to it. It's a very specific crime, terrorism, isn't it? I mean, we could say that Rudakabana was accessing extreme material of all sorts. It's a piece in The Sun on Sunday, his library of hate. He's downloading Al-Qaeda training manuals, Chechnya manuals, Nazi propaganda. He's accessing all sorts of material, but that isn't per se terrorism. Also, what is it with the Home Office and officials always wanting to back away from the uncomfortable truth? And this is the statistic. This is a piece of data that cannot be denied. Islamism is responsible for 94% of all terrorist deaths since 1999 and comprises 80% of all police counter-terror work. So, if Islamic terrorism is overrepresented in the terrorism statistics, why is there this constant need for the Home Office, for instance, to keep on banging on about far-right terrorism? I'm sure far-right terrorism is a problem, but I would suggest in the face of these statistics, it's rather niche. If it's 94% a problem with Islamic extremism, Prevent should be 94% concerned with Islamic terrorists, shouldn't it?
That's what's changed. Trevor Phillips wrote a very, very good piece on this. the broadcaster, but the former chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, who was actually commissioned by Gordon Brown many, many years ago to have a look at the problem of crime affecting black communities. He wrote about this, and he makes the point that a fear, his argument, that was put in the system was that when people started talking about Islamophobia, a lot of public institutions started worrying that to refer people to prevent could be accused of being Islamophobic. And he makes the point that it was after all the discussions about Islamophobia that the number of people referred to prevent around fears over Islamic extremism dropped. And that seems to be where we've got the problem, where the focus has shifted from, as you say, where the actual terrorism problem is, to other issues. And Prevent then started working much more on the far right, and now the Home Office is saying it should be extended further.
What this report's also revealed is like the thinking of civil servants in the Home Office when it comes to two-tier policing. I've heard a lot about two-tier policing when it comes to the Southport riots and how people who posted comments that incited violence on Facebook were treated compared to others. There's also been a discussion, hasn't there, around the pro-Palestinian marches and whether there's been a two-tier approach being softer on people who, as we spoke to Gideon Falter yesterday, are marching through the capital carrying swastikas versus those who object to those carrying swastikas then being carted away. But they're suggesting that any concern over two-tier policing is motivated by a sort of right-wing or far-right agenda. But that can't in itself be right, can it? Because we also had a debate back in the day about two-tier policing of transgender protests. We had feminists, often on the left actually, saying we've got people coming to our events in balaclavas, trying to hound us out of our own events. The police seem to be treating people who are claiming to be transgender with kid gloves compared to actual women trying to stand up for women's rights in a gender-critical way. That can't be interpreted as a far-right position or a right-wing position. Why is a concern about two-tier policing ideological at all? Surely it's about fairness. What's it got to do with the right?
And also, we need data. I think a lot of these things are sort of thrown around without any actual data. If the Home Office are going to make those claims, it needs to have the data underlying it to say that that is the case, that this is only a concern of far right. Because as you say, lots of people are very concerned about the different ways that different parts of our society are policed, and they're not all far right. So I don't understand the logic in the argument. If we move on to the other issue, which is connected to extremism and Prevent, which is these non-crime hate incidents. Now, they came from a different starting point. It was Stephen Lawrence and the murder of the young black teenager in the 1990s. And the response to that, just like the response to 7/7 and the London bombings, was, can we catch racism earlier before a group of white men slaughter and stab to death a young black boy? Perfectly reasonable, just like Prevent was a perfectly reasonable response to 7/7. But then exactly the same thing happens. You get this mission creep. So you start off with just trying to spot behaviours that could lead to racial murders, racially aggravated murders, but then it starts developing into, again, the use of these words, something that might cause psychological harm or someone might be upset about.
Yes.
And then it starts moving into, well, is that free speech, or should people be able to say that, or are you just simply curtailing what people talk about? And that's what happened with our colleague Allison Pearson. Allison Pearson was told that she could have had committed a non-crime hate incident because of a tweet that she had sent out. She wasn't actually told which tweet it was, but it was a tweet apparently. And clearly, again, you start from sort of almost a reasonable position. Stephen Lawrence is killed. We should stop that. 7/7 bombings. That's not a good thing. And then slowly, the way that often public sector organisations operate, and I think it is benign. I don't think it's malicious. But everything is, yes, but we should add that to it. Yes, we should add that to it. I've worked in the public sector, and I remember this even with the clearest direction. So in these instances, ministers, Yvette Cooper has immediately said, that's not what I want to do. And we're going to get on to, I think, some of the Conservative responses when they were in government. But even with firm direction, civil servants, it's called the water glass test. You have a water glass in the middle of a room. You say, that's where we want the water glass to be. We're going to move it over here. And we all agree we're going to move it over there. And everyone agrees in the meeting. And then everyone goes away and they think, yes, but I just want to add this thing in. Or I'm going to speak to some colleagues. I'm going to consult widely. I'm going to speak to other departments. And they move the water glass before you come to the next meeting. And it's that constant change which I think ministers find so frustrating and has led to this whole narrative about the blob. There is something about you give clear direction and the thing that comes back to you is not what you asked for. It's what the civil servants think is the correct answer. And of course, if you're a minister, you're there 1, 2, maybe 5 years. Civil servants are there for decades. So they know that they can sort of outweight you. They're going to be there. They're there often for life.
But then you say it's probably benign and not malevolent. And let's give them the benefit of the doubt for that. But say if we look at the Home Office's handling of the child grooming scandal in this country, and it has real consequences because if actions aren't taken, then future crimes aren't prevented. And so that is really serious. It might not be what they intended, but that is the actual consequence of some of this behaviour. Let's just look back to when Sajid Javid was Home Secretary. Sajid Javid, a Pakistani man, a Muslim man, is concerned that not enough data is being kept on the ethnicity of those who are responsible for child rape in towns like Rotherham, Rochdale, Telford and beyond. He says to the Home Office, we have to look into child sexual exploitation with the specificity in mind that a lot of these perpetrators are Pakistani origin Muslim men. And we need to tackle that and we need a report on it to show the true extent of this and to understand more about whether this crime may have been racially aggravated. Home Office officials basically try and kick this can down the road. They are unwilling to grip the issue and to look at it and to gather data on it. So a little bit further on, he said he wanted this report to be public. They then decide that it's going to be an internal report. The report isn't really done. His successor, Priti Patel, as Home Secretary, ends up being given a sort of series of slides. It's not a proper report. And when the report does come out, it's got the overall finding that actually no, child grooming is predominantly a white problem and not an Asian one. And so Javid and Patel, both ironically of Asian heritage, turn around and say, but no, that's not what we wanted to look at. And Patel goes up to Rotherham. She goes and sees the MP there, Sarah Champion, speaks to victims and says, have you been spoken to adequately by the people who are carrying out this report? They say, no, we've been spoken at by civil servants, but not to. Patel then really kicks off and says, this is ridiculous. We've asked for a proper report on this. Where's the data? Can we identify the ethnicity of the perpetrators and why they've been doing this? Can we gather a body of evidence to inform us when we go forward to prevent this from happening in other communities? Again, the civil servants push back. We then get this fight breaking out between her and her permanent secretary at the time, Philip Rutnam. She's then accused of bullying. She has to put the whole thing on the back burner. Fast forward 5 years and there's now calls for a public inquiry, which incidentally, as far as I can tell, both Javid and Patel support because they were the ministers in the department pushing for something that they then found the civil service pushing back on. But why I say it could be malevolent is, what's the implication of that? Are civil servants saying, well, we can't possibly shine a light on these issues because then the public will say, how have you let this happen? What have you covered up? And what are you going to do about it? By exposing these issues, it puts the civil servants under huge pressure to answer questions about why they were asleep at the wheel and what can be done. The public then, and in the event of a public inquiry, they will demand action. And that makes life difficult for people who haven't taken enough action in the first place.
Certainly more transparency on all these issues would have been incredibly helpful. Maggie Oliver, she's the Greater Manchester police detective who was raising these issues for many, many years and was one of the whistleblowers about the grooming gangs scandal, has said there's a complete failure of data capture. Lots of these questions that are being very legitimately asked, we don't know the answer, but surely if we had had proper investigations 10 years ago, by now we would have those numbers. But we still don't collect ethnicity data around most of crimes against children and most crimes, and that should be collected. And that's what Maggie Oliver has been discussing. There are also other connected things. Poverty. Does any believing young women when they make complaints? There are all sorts of connected issues. I'm sure it's not. I think the other thing that it appears that the civil service struggles to do is believe that two or three things could all be connected and all true. There is a Pakistani heritage issue.
Yes.
There is an issue about are young women who make complaints about being attacked believed, or are they criminalised?
Yeah.
Which is another problem. And there's an issue around class. Are young women who are also poor properly believed in the system? And I'm sure all those things have had some role in the horrific events we have seen. This document was leaked to the Policy Exchange, the think tank, and they make a very good point in the report they've done last night when it was leaked. They say, it is not to say that social ills should not be tackled or terrible crimes such as Southport should not be better prevented, but we believe that there are better ways of dealing with these things rather than trying to force them into the counter-extremism or counter-terrorism space. Surely it's about unearthing what actually works in terms of investigations, where have investigations into grooming gangs gone well, and what can we learn from that, and being completely transparent. The famous line, sunlight, is a good bleach on people's behaviour.
Yeah.
It means that people will start behaving properly if they think they're going to be discovered. And if you are under-informing your minister, exactly as you say, with a few slides and not giving them what you want, you are possibly one of the reasons for that is because you're trying to cover up the fact that it hasn't worked in the past.
But also, there's naturally suspicion around the Home Office if it sees other issues through the prism of race quite happily. It sees Windrush through the prism of race. It sees the Black Lives Matter movement and taking the knee through the prism of race. It looks at Grenfell through the prism of race to a certain extent. It even is happy to consider whether COVID has disproportionately affected people of colour, and yet at the same time, when something is presented to them which involves Islam or Muslims as a specific racial issue, they turn away from it. That doesn't strike the public as being equitable. That's not about, I'm a right-winger and therefore I think this is unfair because I am hostile to Muslims. This is, hang on a minute, you've got to be egalitarian in all of these different areas. You can't be protecting one community at the expense of another because you haven't done it in any other policy areas. So why is it this specific desire to steer away from the Islamic nature of terrorism and, in the case of the grooming gangs, the Islamic nature of the perpetrators? That's what people can't understand.
I think the argument would be that you just be careful with the broadness of our terms. The Pakistani men involved in the grooming gangs come from a specific part of the Muslim diaspora. And what can tend to happen is we just talk about Muslims or we just talk about immigrants. So I suppose there is a concern about that, and that might be perfectly legitimate. But I go back to the point, the best thing to be is transparent. Be very clear, collect the data, publish the data, say what you're going to do, and admit to where there have been failings.
But, and I agree with you entirely, there's no problem seemingly with these civil servants branding anyone with a concern about grooming right wing and far right.
I would challenge that the Home Office were very keen on doing anything about Windrush for years and years and years, even though it was constantly pointed out to them that there were specific Caribbean heritage British people in the UK being targeted by Home Office policies. For years, the Home Office covered that up.
So that's another Home Office failure.
It's not that the Home Office is only squeamish in certain ways when it comes to issues of race. It's squeamish.
Yes.
It's squeamish about transparency.
Yes.
That's what it's squeamish
and
about.
And also it's squeamish about anything racial in terms of actually admitting where the problem lies and doing something about it. And on that subject, immigration.
So, the Office for National Statistics, one of my favourite bodies because
Yes.
it's full of data.
You love reading those papers late at night, don't you?
Absolutely love those charts it brings out. So it has come out today with its population estimates for the future. And as you said, the population in the UK is now set to rise to 72.5 million by the middle of 2032. That's up from 67.6 million in mid-2022.
Before we discuss this, how does that figure just make you feel? Does it make you feel anxious or not? Because lots of people feel anxious when they hear that figure.
That is such a good question, Camilla, because it doesn't make me feel anxious because I am immigrant heritage. So I think of immigration. What's the first thing I think of? My father and my Sudanese roots and, my family and, immigration to me was a good thing. But I completely understand that it does make people anxious. All I would say is I just think take care on the framing of it. If we go back 100 years to 1920, we had a population of around 37 million. If you had said then that the population 100 years later would be nearly 70 million, people would quite legitimately say, well, how on earth is that going to be true? All those people can't fit on this island. That surely can't be the case. Of course, because of the way we live, technological advance, the growth of global movement, things have changed hugely. And I'm usually pretty welcoming of, skilled people bringing their talents all around the world, moving around, whether that's us going to America or people coming here to work or us going to Europe or whatever it might be. I'm pretty positive about that kind of thing. But I do think, Camilla, that the conversation has changed. It's about control of the borders and the size of that increase. And I think that governments of whatever hue have said for many, many years they want to control and bring down immigration. That hasn't happened. Therefore, the public are feeling sceptical, suspicious and anxious. But to ask you, Camilla, the same question, what's your response when you hear the population is going to increase by over 5 million people by 2032?
It does make me feel anxious, and it's a space, not race issue, because from the perspective of our creaking infrastructure, my main and overwhelming fear is that the state will not be able to cope, because we've already got long waiting lists for the NHS. We've already got people queuing for doctors and dentist appointments and in some case extracting their own teeth with pliers. We've got oversubscribed schools in major cities. We've got a quite large degree of disparity now between the haves and the have-nots, which might make me sound quite socialist, but this figure that the number of natural deaths and natural births in this country is just flatlining, and that all of this extra population is coming from immigration, I think is concerning. I think that people generally in 2025 think like you that immigration is a good thing, but that you can have too much of a good thing. I think people want to prioritise quality over quantity. I think for far too long, anyone saying that has been accused of racism and bigotry and xenophobia, when really it's just born out of a concern that our roads and infrastructure might not cope with such a large influx. I think there are really legitimate concerns about people coming in here in huge numbers and not properly assimilating into British society. And I think that there are questions to be asked about the economic value of migrants who come here who aren't working, who are dependent on others and aren't actually giving back to the state. If we think about the wonders of immigration, we think about your late father, a man who comes here from Sudan. He wants to study. He wants to work, he wants to contribute. He then worked for many, many years as an ophthalmologist. Great, that's a wonderful contribution to this country. I think people look at people who come here who haven't got anything necessary to give back to the state, who might end up taking from the state rather than contributing in tax, and they have quite grave reasons for concern. I think if people are coming here, they're not learning the language, they're not integrating themselves into British society, embracing the opportunities that Britain offers, and trying to contribute on a wider level, then that seems as if it is a parasitic relationship, and it's no wonder people then become negative about mass migration. So everyone found that whole Australia point-based system quite attractive because it seemed to be prioritising people who could make the most valuable contribution. That seems to have fallen by the wayside. I don't even really understand how or why.
So I think it's a cultural issue that you raised. There's also an economics issue, which is we have really lacked economic growth over the past 15, 16 years, ever since the financial crisis. One of the ways that we have not looked at how do we produce more wealth here for individuals here is by importing cheaper labour, which is trained abroad. We don't have to worry then about training people here for the jobs that we need to happen. And that means that our response to lack of economic growth is bringing in cheaper labour from abroad. That has meant businesses haven't invested in our population. So there's the cultural issue that you raise, and there's also a very significant economic issue, which is per head, we are not growing. The only growth has come from the fact that our population has grown. So the mass of the pie has grown, but the individual wealth has stayed stagnant. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons for so much skepticism about can politicians fix anything, because individually we have not been getting any wealthier for many, many years.
Also, I think people lack confidence in the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, to sort of solve this issue, because I think they know that ideologically Labour are quite in favour of mass migration and have been since the Blair years. Secondly, do you remember when I spoke to her about this baked-in figure that we just kind of have to accept, that legal migration will now be around 340,000 a year, which I think if you look at any surveys, people on both right and left disagree with. They think that number should be lower. And I asked the Home Secretary about it, and she basically obfuscated. Let's just have a listen. People do want a number to be put on it. It seems to us that most of the data seems to bake in this 350,000 figure a year. Is that too high in your mind, 350,000?
No, and I don't think that anybody has got these proper figures right. So I don't accept the figures that you're talking about.
I mean, that's an IFS figure, I think.
I know. I don't accept.
It might even be an OBR figure, but it seems to be that migration seems to be acceptable at around the 350,000, which is still way, way, way higher than when the last Labour government was in power.
I don't think they've got any particular basis for coming up with those figures, so I don't accept those figures. We've been clear what we need to do is to bring migration down and bring that migration down. I think we know as a country, we've always obviously had people come to the UK to build some of our biggest businesses, to work in public services. That's always been important. But the system has to be controlled and managed. And what we've seen really in the space of just 4 years was the quadrupling of net migration.
People listen to that, and it doesn't make any claim about bringing migration down seem credible, because she wasn't even able to tackle the central issue, which is we have just baked in huge amounts of people coming here, as you say, with an economic argument behind it.
There's a short-term issue here, which is how do we manage our population so that public services can keep up with what is necessary for everybody, not having immigration that is actually a drag on our economic growth. And I think all those issues have not really been tackled. That's the short-term issue. Next 10 years, when I talk about short-term, I'm talking sort of, in a macro sense. Over 10 years, that's a short-term issue. And definitely politicians, if you go back, what I don't understand is the Conservatives have come out today saying this is an absolute outrage, it's far too high.
Yes.
Chris Philp has said, the Shadow Home Secretary has said, this is absolutely appalling.
Yes.
Of course, the highest figure I think it's in our history, isn't it?
That
Was
900,000,
post-COVID under one Rishi Sunak. And I do find it quite baffling for the Conservatives that they allowed this situation to develop when they were in government. but they're furious about it now. That's the short-term issue. And I want to ask you about the politics of it in a second. But then I just want to move it on to this longer-term issue, which is the underlying fact which you highlighted, which is the population that lives here. We're going to be flirting with population decline in getting in towards 2040.
Yes.
The actual population of the UK, like it has across many Western economies, is going to start falling. And then you have a huge problem because you have an aging population, more and more costs, looking after an aging population who aren't working. You need a growing working population. If you're not having babies,
yes,
or young immigrants are not coming here and contributing, you get into this spiral of public sector services cannot keep up with the ageing population.
So J.D. Vance, the Vice President over in the US, has addressed this issue directly this week. Let's hear what he said to the American people.
We failed a generation not only by permitting a culture of abortion on demand, but also by neglecting to help young parents achieve the ingredients they need to live a happy and meaningful life. A culture of radical individualism took root, one where the responsibilities and joys of family life were seen as obstacles to overcome, not as personal fulfillment or personal blessings. Our society has failed to recognize the obligation that one generation has to another is a core part of living in a society to begin with. So let me say very simply, I want more babies in the United States of America.
Okay, so he wants more babies, and you and I have discussed this before on the Daily Tea, like a lot of efforts to make people have more children have failed. But I would say that in this country, one of the main problems is that we haven't incentivized people to have children enough. We haven't got family-friendly taxes. Lots of other countries around Europe and beyond incentivize people to marry. They tax household income rather than individual income. There aren't that many incentives financially these days to actually get married and have children. And that's why we've gone from, I think, that standard of 2.4 children down to about 1.7. I mean, it's declining because why would you have children? It's so expensive. Childcare's too expensive. You don't get any tax breaks for it.
And people like me, i.e. men, don't do enough. The whole undervaluing of family and the fact that it is still broadly seen as the responsibility of women to bring up children is appalling. Men should have as many income effects on having a child as a woman has. And there's this complete mismatch between talking, I don't know what J.D. Vance and the policies might be in America, but there is a total mismatch in talking about women should have more babies. It should be also men have to support much more the bringing up of families in the way that we work, in the way that who we imagine should be taking time off. Of course, it should always be an individual decision. But certainly I feel my side of the gender divide, we've had it pretty easy over the past decades and, well, hundreds of years probably. And we have to revalue what is the value to a Western economy of bringing up children, and it should be borne equally between men and women.
Also, social media can't be helping this. You've got a whole generation that aren't going out as much, physically leaving the house, aren't getting together with people. I mean, we've seen the end of the sort of discotheque era. There's been a lot of studies about how we're all becoming far less sociable. I'm sorry, but staying at home and watching Netflix isn't conducive to procreation. That is a major problem, and I think this is only going to get worse. That's why the government needs to step up and offer young people even more help to start a family, to get on the property ladder, and to actually have, I know it sounds controversial, it sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it, with population set to rise by 5 million over the course of less than 10 years, to actually have more children, not fewer or no children at all.
If we look at places that are already suffering with population decline, South Korea, Italy, they have attempted all sorts of pro-family policies, and the public, who are frankly sceptical about the government, as we've been discussing, doing anything in the right way, are not listening and we are having fewer and fewer children. There needs to be a systemic change in what we imagine parenting is. We can't keep relying on just half of the population to solve this problem.
Amen to that, Kamal, or should I be saying women?